The rain tapped lightly against the window of the physical therapy center in Boston, where 19-year-old Emily Whitford sat slumped in her wheelchair. As the daughter of Robert Whitford, a paralyzed CEO worth billions, she had access to the best doctors, the finest rehab equipment, and a team of world-class specialists. But after 2 years of trying to walk again following a devastating car accident, her hope had run dry. That day, she whispered to herself, maybe I should just stop trying. The words so faint she wasn't sure if she wanted anyone to hear them at all. In the corner, Jake Turner overheard her. He wasn't a therapist or a doctor. He was the building's maintenance mechanic, a single dad to a 10-year-old girl. Jake had been fixing a faulty treadmill when her quiet words stopped him cold. He knew the sound of giving up. Years ago, after losing his wife to cancer, he had nearly surrendered to his own grief. Wiping grease from his hands, he wheeled the treadmill aside and walked over. "Don't," he said softly, his voice steady but warm. "Don't quit yet." Emily looked at him with tired, guarded eyes. "You don't understand," she muttered, her tone sharp but hollow. Jake crouched down so he was at her eye level, ignoring the smudge of oil across his sleeve. "I might not know your exact pain," he said, "but I know what it feels like to lose a fight before it's over. My daughter needed me to keep going, and I think someone out there needs you to keep going too." His gaze held no pity, only a quiet conviction that made her hesitate. Her lips pressed together as if she wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. "I promise," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "I'll help you. Every single day until you walk again." Emily let out a breath, the kind that carried exhaustion more than disbelief. "You're not a therapist," she reminded him. "No," Jake admitted, "but I'm stubborn, and I'm here every day. Sometimes that's enough." She didn't answer, but she didn't tell him to leave either. That afternoon, Jake returned after his shift, a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Inside were simple things: resistance bands, a stress ball, a pair of sneakers that looked brand new, but clearly not expensive. "For when you're ready," he said, placing them beside her chair. Emily eyed the sneakers, then him, with something between curiosity and skepticism. "What makes you think I'll ever be ready?" she asked. Jake smiled faintly. "Because I've seen people fight harder for less." Over the next week, he began showing up at her scheduled therapy times, leaning against the wall while she worked with her official trainer. He didn't interrupt, but when her arms trembled from pushing, herself upright or her voice cracked with frustration, he would offer a simple, "One more time," or "You've got this." It was small, almost invisible encouragement, but she noticed, and more importantly, she didn't feel as alone as she had before. One morning, Emily arrived at the center to find Jake already waiting, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Black or sweet?" he asked, extending one toward her. She accepted with a small nod, inhaling the warm steam. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He shrugged. "Because someone once reminded me that quitting doesn't make the pain go away. It just makes sure nothing ever gets better." His words lodged somewhere deep in her chest, in a place she thought was already closed off. Jake started adding tiny challenges outside of her regular therapy. "Hold this for 30 seconds, he'd say, handing her a small weight. Or, "Try pushing yourself to that mark on the wall." At first, she resisted, saying it wasn't part of the program, but he'd answer, "Neither was you talking to me last week." Against her better judgment, she began to comply, and sometimes she surprised herself by managing more than she thought she could. Late one afternoon, as the center emptied out, Jake found her staring at the parallel bars in the corner. "What?" he asked, following her gaze. "Nothing," she said quickly, but he didn't look away. "You want to try them?" She shook her head. "I've tried. I fall." Jake nodded. Then we fall together." There was something so plain and certain about his tone that it dismantled the excuses she had carefully built over months. She wheeled over. With his help, she gripped the bars, her arms tense, her breath shallow. "Slow," he murmured. She pulled herself upright, her legs trembling beneath her. For the first time in months, she managed to stay, standing for nearly 15 seconds before her knees buckled. Jake caught her before she hit the ground. She braced for him to say, "Good job," or "That's progress." Instead, he simply said, "Tomorrow we'll go for 20. It wasn't praise, it was expectation. Days turned into weeks, and while her progress was slow, it was steady. She began to notice subtle changes, her endurance improving, her arms less sore after each session, her confidence flickering back in moments when she caught herself standing longer than before. Jake never once treated her like she was fragile. If anything, he pushed her harder than anyone else had, and strangely, that made her trust him more. He didn't see her as a billionaire's daughter, he saw her as a fighter. Emily's father, Robert Whitford, had noticed the change too. Though he rarely spoke about it, he saw the shift in her eyes when she came home. One evening he asked her directly, "What's different?" She thought about telling him the truth about Jake, the maintenance mechanic who refused to let her quit, but she only said, "I guess I just decided to try again." Robert, himself paralyzed from the waist down, gave her a knowing look. Trying again is the hardest decision of all. On rainy Thursday, the power flickered in the building, shutting down most of the therapy equipment. Many patients cancelled their sessions, but Emily showed up anyway. Jake met her at the door with a flashlight and said, "Guess we're going old school today." They practiced with nothing but resistance bands and the parallel bars, her determination cutting through the dim light. By the time the lights came back on, her shirt was damp with sweat, but she was smiling a rare, genuine smile. Later that week, Emily admitted something she had never told anyone outside her family. "After the accident," she said quietly, "I told myself if I couldn't walk again by 20, I'd stop trying." Jake listened without interrupting. "And when's your birthday?" he asked. "In 2 months, she said. He nodded. "Then we've got 60 days to prove you wrong." There was no pity in his voice, just a stubborn certainty that made her believe, for the first time, that maybe he could be right. Jake's daughter, Lily, began stopping by the center after school, usually carrying her homework and a pack of crackers. She would sit near Emily, chattering about her day, while Jake worked on small repairs around the room. Sometimes Lily would cheer her on mid-exercise, clapping when Emily reached a goal. It was the first time Emily had felt connected to someone. Outside the world of doctors and therapists, and the laughter that came with it made the hard days easier to bear. On Friday, when her regular therapist was out sick, Jake stepped in to guide her session. Though he lacked the professional training, he compensated with persistence. "Again," he'd say every time she completed a set, "and slower this time." By the end, her arms burned and her legs shook, but she had stood for a record 35 seconds. She tried to hide the grin tugging at her lips, but Jake noticed. "That's the look of someone who's winning," he said. By the end of the first month, the staff began to notice Emily's improvement. Her attendance was perfect, her stamina higher, her attitude different. One of the nurses told her, "You're a whole new person lately." Emily thought about that later, realizing it wasn't just physical strength she was gaining, it was belief. And it hadn't come from any cutting-edge machine or advanced medical plan. It had come from a man with a toolbox, a history of loss, and an unshakable promise. On a quiet Saturday morning, when the center was nearly empty, Jake suggested something new. "Let's try 2 steps, he said. Emily froze. "That's not possible," she insisted. Jake simply replied, "Not yet." With his hands ready to steady her, she pulled herself up at the bars, her weight shifting awkwardly between her legs. Her Right foot slid forward one step, then her left. By the time she sank back into her chair, her chest was heaving, but her eyes were brighter than they had been in years. That night, she couldn't stop replaying those 2 steps in her mind. They were small, unsteady, and imperfect, but they were hers. For the first time in 2 years, she felt the impossible bend, just slightly, toward possible. And when she thought about the man who had made her believe it, she knew that whatever happened next, she couldn't go back to the girl who had once whispered, "Maybe I should just stop trying." Jake had made sure of that. Jake kept his word without fail. Every morning before heading to his shift at the auto shop, he showed up at the rehabilitation center. At first, he stood quietly in the corner, watching Emily's therapy sessions, memorizing the therapist's cues, and studying each movement she attempted. Though untrained, he was determined to learn, to be an extra set of hands when she needed them. He encouraged her when she faltered, teased her into laughter during the painful stretches, and sometimes simply sat in silence when the frustration became too much for her to speak. His presence became her steady anchor. Emily's therapist began to notice something they couldn't quite explain. Her once measured, hesitant effort had shifted sharper, more determined. She started pushing herself through each repetition as if Jake's belief in her had become her own. He had a way of distracting her from the pain without diminishing her focus. He'd tell a story about a stubborn old pickup truck that refused to start until the 100th try, subtly comparing it to her own persistence. Little by little, that quiet fire inside her grew, and with it, her confidence. The progress was slow, but it was progress nonetheless. Outside the therapy room, Jake's life hadn't changed much. He still came home to his modest apartment, ate simple meals, and spent his evenings under the hood of cars. But internally, something had shifted. Helping Emily gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his own father was alive. She reminded him of himself in ways he couldn't explain, the way she met challenges head-on, even when the odds felt crushing. Somewhere between the jokes and the quiet encouragement, their connection had deepened into something unspoken but undeniable. Robert Whitford, Emily's father, noticed too. At first, he had been wary of the mechanic who kept showing up in his daughter's life. He was a man used to controlling every aspect of his world, and Jake's humble background didn't exactly inspire trust, but Robert had watched from a distance, quietly evaluating. He'd seen how Emily's eyes lit up when Jake walked into the room, how her posture straightened, and how her progress seemed to accelerate with him there. For a man used to measuring success in numbers and profits, this was something entirely different and far more valuable. Months passed, each one bringing Emily closer to a milestone none of them dared to say aloud. The day finally came in early spring. The rehabilitation center's staff pretended to be busy, though everyone's attention was fixed on the parallel bars. Emily stood at one end, her hands gripping the cool metal, her knuckles white. Jake stood at the other, arms open, not with a stopwatch or any measure of time, just patience. Her knees trembled with the first step. The room was so quiet she could hear her own breath, each inhale and exhale a victory in itself. Her feet moved slowly, each one a test of balance and resolve. The distance between them felt like miles. Jake didn't move forward or urge her faster. He let her set the pace, meeting her with words only when her eyes flickered toward him. "You're doing it," he said softly, the kind of tone that carried no doubt. Step by step she made her way forward, her breathing ragged but her gaze locked on his. When she finally reached him, she didn't just walk into his arms, she fell into them, tears spilling freely. "You kept your promise," she whispered against his shoulder, her voice breaking. Jake's arms tightened around her, not in triumph, but in quiet relief. In that moment, nothing else existed, not the long months of effort, not the obstacles still ahead. She had walked again, and he had been there to see it. Across the room, Robert stood in the doorway, frozen in place. The image before him was something he knew he would never forget: his daughter, standing on her own, wrapped in the arms of the man who had refused to give up on her. For months, Robert had been watching Jake from afar. He had seen a man who didn't care about wealth, status, or recognition. Jake's consistency, humility, and sheer will had restored something money never could. Robert stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the quiet room. Emily looked up at him with wet eyes, and Jake gently stepped aside. "You've given me back my daughter," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion, "and for that I owe you more than money can buy." Jake shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "All I wanted was for her to believe in herself again." But Robert wasn't a man who left debts unpaid. That night, long after the center had closed and Jake had returned to his small apartment, Robert sat in his study, thinking. For a man worth billions, he knew the rarest treasures were those that couldn't be bought. Jake had given him one of those. By morning, Robert had made up his mind. He had spent his life building companies, buying and selling empires, yet in this case the transaction wasn't about business. It was about gratitude, respect, and a kind of friendship that came unexpectedly. The next day, Jake was in the middle of changing the oil on an old station wagon when he heard someone calling his name from the garage entrance. Wiping his hands on a rag, he turned to see Robert Whitford himself stepping inside, looking oddly out of place among the greasy tools and oil stains. "We need to talk," Robert said simply. The other mechanics stopped what they were doing, sensing something unusual. Jake led him outside to the quiet lot. Behind the shop, his curiosity piqued. Robert wasted no time. "I have a proposition for you," he began. Jake crossed his arms, wary. "If it's about money, I'm not interested," he said firmly. Robert shook his head. "It's not about paying you off. It's about giving you the means to do what you've already been doing, helping people." He went on to explain his idea. A foundation dedicated to supporting rehabilitation programs, providing resources to families who couldn't afford them. "I want you to run it," Robert said. "You've shown me something no board member or executive ever has: what it means to invest in someone's life, not just their potential profit." The weight of Robert's words sank in slowly. Jake wasn't a man used to grand opportunities or public roles. His life had been simple, grounded in hard work and modest means. But the thought of being able to help others like Emily on a larger scale stirred something inside him. "Why me?" he asked quietly. Robert's answer was simple. "Because you cared when you didn't have to, because you kept showing up when no one expected you to, and because I trust you." It wasn't a business pitch, it was an invitation to change countless lives. Jake took a long breath, looking out at the lot where old cars sat waiting for repairs. The garage had been his world for years. But now there was a bigger road ahead, one he hadn't planned for but couldn't ignore. "If I do this," he said finally, "I want it to be about the people, not the headlines." Robert smiled faintly. "That's exactly why I came to you." They shook hands, not as billionaire and mechanic, but as two men who understood the value of a promise kept. It was the start of something neither had anticipated. When Emily heard the news later that week, she was overjoyed. "You're going to help so many people, Jake," she said, her voice brimming with pride. She had seen firsthand what his presence could do, the way it turned doubt into determination. "You helped me take my first steps," she added. "Now you're going to help others do the same." Her words stayed with him, a quiet reminder that sometimes the smallest moments, a morning visit, a word of encouragement, could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. In the months that followed, Jake transitioned from the grease-stained world of carburetors and wrenches to the polished offices of the foundation. At first, he felt like a stranger in that environment, the tailored suits, the meetings, the carefully worded proposals. But every time he felt out of place, he thought of Emily. He remembered her determination, the way she had met each challenge with quiet grit. It gave him the confidence to speak up, to insist the foundation remain rooted in personal connection, not just corporate efficiency. Slowly, he began shaping it into something deeply human. The work wasn't easy. Jake visited rehab centers across the country, meeting patients and families, listening to their stories. He made it a rule never to promise what he couldn't deliver, but when he committed to helping someone, he saw it through. Robert stayed involved, but gave Jake full trust to make decisions. Emily often joined them on visits, sharing her own journey, and proving with every step she took that recovery was possible. Together, they built something that wasn't just about funding, it was about restoring hope, one person at a time. Years later, on the anniversary of the day Emily first walked again, the three of them stood together at a newly opened rehabilitation wing funded entirely by the foundation. Reporters gathered, cameras flashed, but Jake barely noticed. He was watching Emily standing tall, her smile radiant, greeting patients who were just starting their own journeys. Robert leaned over and said quietly, "You see, Jake, you didn't just keep your promise to her. You've kept it to every person who walks through those doors." Jake didn't reply immediately, but when he did, his voice was steady. "That's all I ever wanted.